So one of the things that has always fascinated me about creators of any kind, writers, singers, musicians, artists, whatever, is why they create what they create. Like, what is it that motivates them to create the things that they do? What inspires a song or a painting or an actor to take a certain path with a role, or especially in my field, a writer to create a world that they do? That's always fascinated me. What is it that backs that? Just this past week, I was just chatting with my mother, who had recently read my book, Kill Town, my most recent book, my first horror novel. And she looked at me and said, "Where do you get your ideas from?" Which she probably followed up by saying, "What's wrong with you, son?" And I feel like that's a good thing as a writer, especially horror writer, if you're freaking your mom out about what you're doing and what you're writing. But it made me think, and several other things over the past week have made me really kind of ponder this. Like, where does something come from? Where does an idea come from? And so today, for this particular session of the Didactic Cafe, we're going to talk about that. And as I said, my name is Chad Lehrman, and I'm your host today for the Didactic Cafe. So earlier this week in my classes, we were doing what we normally do. It's this thing that we call press conference. And usually what we do is we have a student sit at the front of the room, and that student begins to talk a little bit about, or actually answers questions. So for 2 minutes, everybody in the classroom sort of throws out questions. What's your favorite color? What's your favorite coffee? Why are you taking this class? All sorts of different things. Like, what do you want to be when you grow up? Good questions like that. Well, on Friday, right before Thanksgiving, I decided to put myself in the chair. And one of the questions that came from one of the students was, what inspires you? What is it that gets you to write what you write? And of course, I didn't know. The truth is that I know. It's a very big question. It's each book that I write has something different to it. Each book that I write has a different sort of inspiration to it. And so I mentioned Kill Town. That really... my mom was, of course, concerned for my mental health and writing a book about serial killers killing everybody they can in a town. But really it comes from sort of my own feelings about small towns. Like, I feel like there's this very powerful storytelling device in the small town. It's why so many people watch Friday Night Lights. Like, this was a great TV show. It was super popular, connected with so many people because it was about essentially a small town. Football was the hook. Football is what drew people into watching it. But it was the small town sort of story. And that's one way you can take a small town. You can talk about the inspiring things, or the sort of back and forth small town politics. And Friday Night Lights did an amazing job of that. And I think it's awesome. I just chose to take that same sort of small town mindset and twist it. That's what Kill Town really did for me. It was this opportunity to talk about the dark side of town. But today, I don't really want to talk about Kill Town so much as I do want to talk about the genesis of my first novel. My first novel, the Sawyer Shepherd Chronicles, Rites of Passage. And so the Sawyer Shepherd Chronicles here is my first attempt at a novel, and it's really coming from a story that extended all the way back to when I was a teenager. When I was in high school, writing a very rudimentary first draft, if you will, of a couple of chapters of this story idea of a small town. Again, there you go, small towns. A small town, some high school students who kind of suspected that their teacher was the devil. And that's really kind of the beginning of where Sawyer Shepherd comes from. There was no Sawyer Shepherd. There was no Mandy. There was no Eli. But there was a Lucius Furr. The Lucius Edward Furr was this character who was coming into town, mysterious. And to be completely honest, at the time, Lucius Furr was exactly modeled on, Die Hard and Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, superstar, later to be known as Snape, Alan Rickman. By the way, just to be clear, I had not read, this was like 1995, 1996 when I was writing this. I had not read Harry Potter. None of the books had come out with Alan Rickman playing, or none of the movies had come out with Alan Rickman playing Snape, but that was the envisionment that I had, this idea of this dark, creepy character. Because honestly, as a 14-year-old kid, 15-year-old kid, the Prince of Thieves, Sheriff of Nottingham, Alan Rickman's character was like the ultimate evil. Like, that guy was bad. And so like I loved that. I loved his characterization. So that's really where it started, was this story, this idea that these youth in this community would band together against this evil teacher who may or may not have been the devil, and fight him. So the name was there. The name was present. And I always thought that, you know, as a teenager, I thought it was cool and kitschy. I didn't even know that word. As a kid, I thought it was fun to play with the idea of Lucius Edward Fur, Luce E. Fur, as this sort of devilish name. I realize now it's a really bad dad joke, but I also leaned into that with Sawyer Shepherd, putting that character in that position. And of course, if you've read Rites of Passage, you know that Lucius Edward Fur is not a high school teacher. He doesn't look exactly like Alan Rickman. And to be honest, his intentions are rather, hard to understand, at least in this book. Like we get a little bit more of him as the series progresses, but we don't really know exactly what his motivations are. We know he's probably not the nicest guy, but that motivation is present. But all this to say that as a 14, 15, 16-year-old kid writing these ideas and getting this concept down, it began to gestate. And then I go off to college. I go off to career and family and all these different things. And nothing really sort of latches on, if you will. Nothing really, no writing really begins during that time. And I kind of just put the ideas in the back of my head. And they ruminate and they manifest in different ways. So flash forward to me turning 39 and going, I want to have done something with my life. I want to write a book. So I had gone back to the idea a couple of years before that. I may be trying to write, but I talked about it, but I wouldn't do anything. That's one of the biggest problems I think in writing, is that we spend a lot of time talking about things, but we don't actually do them. Funny thing is, that's life. We spend a lot of time talking about things, but we don't actually ever do them. And there was something about coming up on that age of 30 that made me go, it's time to stop talking and time to start doing. So I did. Coming up on age of 40, yeah. So I began to sit down and write this story, which originally started off as The Wendigo, was the title of the story. And Sawyer Shepherd at this time makes his first appearance. But Sawyer Shepherd in this particular story is a 30-something-year-old man with a family going on vacation in his town. And I was writing me. Honestly. And I decided fairly quickly that was not the right way to go. That we needed to have a character who was still figuring out who he was, like where he was coming from, what his life was all about. So Sawyer Shepherd, in the first iteration, family man, like that lasted about a day. And then all of a sudden, Sawyer Shepherd is a teenager. And Sawyer Shepherd is a teenager who has lost everything that he has ever loved in his life. And he is trying to find himself, because what better way to challenge a young man than to take away everything he cares about and put him in an insurmountable situation where survival is not easy to attain. So I put him there. And Sawyer walks into Sage City, Colorado, and pretty quickly everything falls apart, even more than they already had for the poor kid. So that's really where the story idea kind of came from. Now, Wendigo, the original character was an actual Wendigo. The demon was a Wendigo figure, heavily inspired by Supernatural, the TV series, episode 2, with this idea that a killer becomes a cannibal who then consumes so much human flesh that they become this monster. And I wanted to play with that a little bit. So the more I got into it, the more I looked into the history of the town that inspires Sage City, which is a town known as Lake City, Colorado. And my family and I visited there numerous times. My wife has been going there since she was a tiny kid. And as you drive into Sage City, Lake City. Actually, both. It goes both ways. As you drive into Sage City, the mythical city that I've created here for Sawyer Shepherd to have his journey in, as you drive in, there's this marker that talks about the cannibal pastor. Well, as you drive into Lake City, the real city upon which Sage City is based on, there's a marker that talks about a cannibal prospector by the name of Alfred Packer. Not Alfred, Alfred. Alfred Packer was this guy who he and some of his fellow mining companions got trapped in the snowdrifts outside of Lake City, literally like right there. I mean, you're where you're looking at this sign where the site apparently occurred. I mean, like the city is right there. And in this particular situation, he is the only survivor. He comes back. He admits to having eaten some of his companions, but upon investigation, there is some belief that he may have hastened along their end, if you will. He may have killed them in order to eat them. And there's trials and things go on. And eventually he was, I know eventually his story ends with him being acquitted of it. But that story always stuck with me from the first time that I read that story coming in, and then like I put that in there in Sawyer Shepherd, because I wanted there to be this idea that the town endured this legend of a human gone horribly wrong, like really, really messed up stuff, guys, like bad. I wanted that story to be in there. And so in this, I put, again, I like to take things that everybody trusts and twist it. And so I made it a cannibal pastor. But as we find out very early in the story, maybe history is not what we always think it is, and that sort of unravels. And that's really another theme that recurs in Sawyer Shepherd Chronicles Rites of Passage, is that sometimes what we thought was true maybe isn't exactly right or accurate. That we are always being forced to examine new things and understand new things. So Sawyer Shepherd really kicks off in that genre with Rites of Passage, which is, of the Sawyer Shepherd books to this point, probably the most horror themed of them all. You've got this monster in an isolated town in a snowstorm, survival. And yes, there are supernatural monsters, there are killers all the way through, but this is really the one that I think has the biggest creepy factor to it. And so what I wanted to do today was I wanted to read a brief passage from one of the scenes in the book, which kind of captures that. And as I finish this, I'll come back and talk a little bit about more where the series is going, as I'm wrapping up book 4 of 5, and I'm beginning book 5 of the series. And so hopefully if you're watching this and you have not read this, Sawyer Shepherd Rites of Passage, you'll take a consideration and check it out. So we start here, and I'm actually going to jump into chapter 3, and mainly because it's got some action to it. And what you need to know at this point is that Sawyer has met up with a guy named Eli, who's the quote-unquote town drunk. He's also met up with a girl named Mandy, who he forms an instant attraction to because he's 18 and a guy, and that's what happens when you meet a pretty girl. And then he's also encountered Lucius Edward Furr, who at this point is this billionaire mogul who's come to town with his number 2 guy, Lennox Dupree, and their possible investor, a woman by the name of Elena Cordova, and they're trying to control the city. So, chapter 3 is titled Running, and it goes like this. Black, gray, colors, buzzing. Sawyer must have only been out for a second, but when he came to, this was what the world revealed to him. He couldn't hear anything but the buzzing, then muffled sounds. Pops. He raised his hand to his forehead, which was throbbing, and pulled it back to see a small dot of blood, most likely from a piece of stone shrapnel. He heard more pops, then some muffled yelling. The air smelled of cobalt and dust, an old dust, like when you open a long-forgotten trunk in the attic. His vision cleared more, and then he shook his head and took in the scene. Snow and dust mingled in the air, making even what he could see foggy. He could make out a black figure, one of Furr's men, apparently shooting into the fog. He could not see the other one, but he did sound like it was where the yelling was coming from. Eli was already standing, very sober, and had a knife drawn. Wait, he had a knife the whole time? Steve was still out on the ground a few feet in front of Sawyer, and Furr was sitting up next to him, watching this man shoot his gun with disinterested, far-off look. He could not see Mandy, but she had been back near Sawyer when the explosion happened. Sawyer stood up, his hearing clearing up a bit, only to be assaulted by the gunfire. He was about to look for Mandy when a piercing scream ripped the meadow. Something wet and warm hit Sawyer in the face, and something flew out of the fog. Sawyer touched this face again and looked down at what had struck his face. His hand was covered in blood. The thing that flew out of the smoke had thudded on the ground a few feet away. It was an arm, still clutching a handgun. The fog had started to dissipate a bit, and Sawyer saw that Fur was still frozen, just sitting and staring into the fog. His hair was flapping wetly against his head when he was not floating heavily up into the air on wind gusts. The splash of blood that hit Sawyer had been blunted by Fur, who caught the bulk of it. Fur was mostly covered in the thick red stuff. Whatever was in the fog had now turned those green eyes toward Fur and had begun to slowly move. The only thing Sawyer could make out were the eyes set in a large shape, moving beneath the snow and dust. But the direction toward Fur was clear, so Sawyer dashed at Fur and pulled him away from the form. It kept advancing on Fur and finally cleared the debris fog. And then it was gone. Sawyer had been looking at the eyes and then they simply disappeared. One of the quote-unquote geologists came out of the slowly settling fog with a gun drawn, clearly not the one with the missing arm. "Where did it go?" he yelled. It just vanished," Sawyer replied, searching the area. Eli was stock still. His eyes were here and there in an orderly manner, as if doing a grid search with those eyes. They suddenly stopped, behind the man with the gun. "Behind you!" he yelled and threw his knife. Too late. Blood and gore exploded from the man's chest as more blood spurted from his neck. The knife still found its mark between the two eyes and passed through thin air. Wide-eyed, Sawyer realized this thing was apparently intangible and invisible. Mostly. The eyes shone, but at least gave a decent approximation of where it was. The knife did not bother the thing, and with every chomping bite into the now dead geologist, more small patches of red snow appeared. Eli had drawn another knife and was advancing on the thing. Steve had begun to stir. Then he heard Mandy's cry for help. He looked at Eli, and Eli said, "Go." Sawyer ran, jumping over a burning log that must have been in the shaft before the explosion. He could feel the waves of heat rising off the ashen wood as he sailed over it, the smell of charcoal strong in his nostrils. The smoke was clearing, but the snow was picking up. Still, in the blizzard, Sawyer could make out Mandy on the ground, her right foot wedged in between two boulders. "Wait, don't pull, I've got it." Sawyer had seen something once before in 7th grade when his friend Cole had gotten his ankle stuck in between some wood. Or had it been rocks then too? Cole tried to pull it out himself and snapped his ankle. And he was in a boot for a month. Sawyer looked at the ankle while listening for the sound of the thing Eli was fighting. Or, if he could spare himself hope, Eli. Mandy did not appear to have a severe injury, so Sawyer planted his feet and used his body weight to push one boulder away. "Okay now," he grunted. He slid her foot out and stood with minimal effort. "What happened?" she asked, still somewhat dazed. "No real time for that. We need to grab Steve, Eli, and the rich guy and get out of here." "What about the geologist?" "Let's just say they aren't going to be able to just walk it off." They ambled back toward the spot where Sawyer had just been, partly to check Mandy's capabilities, but also because Sawyer was not sure what he would find. Eli was nowhere to be seen, and Steve was on his knees but bent over. Fur was still wide-eyed, staring at nothing. "Where's Eli?" Sawyer asked. Without raising up, Steve gestured to the edge of the woods. "You chased the bear or whatever it was into the woods." "That wasn't a bear, Steve. Bears have fur and are visible. We may not have many bears in Texas, but I know what they look like." Mandy was wide-eyed and looking between the two of them. "Bear?" "Not a bear," corrected Sawyer. "Invisible bear, maybe." Just then there was a crash as Eli came flying out of the tree line. He hit the ground and slid across the accumulating snow, only 5 feet from the rest of them. Eli still had the knife, but his jacket was ripped and he was out of breath. He turned toward them, shock covering his face, and yelled, "Run! I can't stop this thing!" Then the thing, apparently, stepped into the clearing. The eye still glowed, but there were a few spots of snow was accumulating to give the beast some semblance of shape. It was massive, but that was all they could see. Human-like, but it almost appeared as if there were horns on the head, straight out like a bull's. They could see the footprints in the snow, human-like, but clawed. The small amounts of snow now collecting over the eyes seemed to almost give it eyebrows. Steve screamed. Then Mandy said, "Oh my." And Sawyer added, "Crap." Fur just hummed. Eli turned to face the thing, and Steve and Mandy ran to lift Fur off the ground. Sawyer watched as the creature seemed to advance on Eli, whose eyes seemed to be targeting the assumed center mass of the beast and the thing's eyes. It raised its head, then closed its eyes, and it was gone. Not taking his eyes from the spot where the thing was, Eli said again, "Run, now! Warn the town to get out while they can." It would have sounded a bit too campy if not for the fact that there was an invisible bear bull trying to kill them. Mandy and Steve were headed down the trail with Fur wrapped around their shoulders. Then Eli was lifted off the ground by 2 feet and suspended in the air. Then Sawyer saw the eyes open, just 6 inches from Eli's face. He took an automatic step back and kicked something with his canvas shoe. The burning log. Without thinking, Sawyer grabbed the wood about 4 feet long, burning on both ends, but not in the middle, and raised it above his head. And then he charged the thing. He originally wanted to aim for the eyes, but fearing he would hit Eli, he decided to target the torso. At the moment he was in reach, he felt a nudge in the back of his head. Aim for the spot directly across Eli's midsection. So he did. The thing howled and dropped Eli instantly. It apparently turned and ran, based on the footprints back to the trees. Its howl seemed to be going away. The log had trailed along for a bit, but had fallen off at the tree's edge. Sawyer turned to Eli and offered a hand. "So, about this whole town drunk thing?" So this particular passage of the story puts us in a place where Sawyer is first encountering the demon, the monster of the book. I wanted to capture the idea of mystery here because we don't know what it is. I think one of the most effective things in horror is when you don't see that shape, that thing. I think it's what made movies like Halloween so compelling, at least the original, was that you didn't really get a full glimpse of the guy until much later on in the story. It's the same thing in more recent stuff. Like if you look at movies like Signs from the 2000s, where you don't really see these monsters, these aliens that are coming, until this is one teeny tiny scene where a kid is watching a video, or there's a video playing from a kid's party, and you see this creature move across. And I remember stopping that movie and watching that scene over and over and over again, trying to understand, like, what is this? So there's something in the idea of hiding the monster that I very much enjoyed with the story. So as that being said, I really enjoyed writing the action parts of it. And I found that in writing Sawyer Shepherd, I need, by the way, keeping in mind, this is my first novel. Ta-da. So I can, even reading it now, I see things that are clunky, things that I would change, writing that I would work on. And so being an independent publisher, I can go back and edit those things. After the series is done here fairly soon, it's possible that I'll go back and say, hey, I'm going to do a director's cut, quote unquote, of the particular thing. But for now, I look at it and I go, okay, man, I can see growth. Like, I can see that I'm growing as a writer. I'm getting much better. But I've always really enjoyed writing the action scenes. There's something about playing the scenes in my head like a movie. When I write, I see it as though it's a movie, like I'm shooting it. And so with all that being said, I want to kind of come back to the initial thing of, why do I write what I write? Why do I write the things that I do? And Sawyer is definitely inspired by like elements of supernatural. I've told people before, it's Percy Jackson in a Judeo-Christian setting instead of the pantheon of the Greek god setting. And as I wrote the series without ever even really thinking about it, I realized that by the time I got to about book 3, I had put Sawyer on the hero's journey, Joseph Campbell's hero's journey, and didn't even realize it. And realize that there's that inherent story to be told of a character who has a mentor, who experiences loss, who learns, who gains unique supernatural wisdom or insight or whatever it might be, and then moves on, that fights the battle. And there's something compelling about that. I wanted to write a character that grows and develops as the series goes along, who has to accept leadership roles, who has to accept gifts and abilities and powers and a destiny that he didn't know, and has to come to realize that things that he always thought were true about his life, they weren't. Because for me, I think we all go through those moments where we realize things aren't what they seem, that things are not as black and white or easy to understand. And this is a character who talks about that. There are times where he dives into that leadership role so easily and handily, and then there's times where he makes mistakes. And I wanted there to be a leader and a powerful, heroic figure that was like that. But I also wanted to surround him with equally human characters. I really wanted to try to create a situation where Mandy was not a typical damsel in distress, where she picks up the swords and she fights too. And there's definitely elements of that in Rites of Passage, and especially as we move further into the stories. I wanted to write a typical mentor who wasn't a typical mentor. I wanted to be a guy who, from the outside looking in, looked like he had everything screwed up, but he kind of knew what it was. He knew things on a different level. I wanted to play with the idea of what is a bad guy, what is a good guy. And so some of the characters, I think every character has a little bit of an arc, but I think some of them have a bigger arc. I think some of them travel a very big trajectory. And so right now, like I said, I'm finished editing with book 4. I'm getting ready to put the cover out and put book 4 out for publication. And I'm writing book 5. And book 5 picks up right after the end of book 4. And I don't want to say anything else about that, because I think that book 4 ends on the absolute biggest cliffhanger I've ever written. And book 5 is in every way I possibly can. I'm paying the dues of that cliffhanger. I want it to be real. I want it to feel. I want it to make sense and be good. But it's also a powerful moment to be sitting here writing the final stories. What I believe to be the final chapter of Sawyer Shepherd. Whether or not this means that there will be something in this world again, I don't know. But for now, I'm having tasted a little bit of writing outside of Sawyer Shepherd's world, and I'm ready to do more of that. But I really want to do justice to the series with book 5. And so, I've really been just kind of one of the long podcast plug of a book, but I did want to give you the idea of why I write what I write. And if you like small towns and you like the darker side of small towns, because I do think it's there. I think Sawyer Shepherd does a lot of that, especially as you get into book 3. If you like the idea of a young adult series where somebody is figuring out who they are, then I think it's for you. I mean, I think it's again, Percy Jackson, very similar, a little bit of Harry Potter thrown in there, definitely some supernatural influence, Dean and Sam Winchester. Sawyer is a very much more Boy Scouty version of Dean, for sure. And I know I also said that the original Sawyer was a 35, 40-year-old guy with kids, so I was writing me. Well, Sawyer Shepherd is me if I had made a very different path in life. He's still a very, very, very close character to my heart. And so I hope you love reading the books as much as I've loved writing them. And so with that being said, I'm going to sign off. Hope you guys have enjoyed the Didactic Cafe. We'll see you again soon. So real quick plug for everything else. If you are interested in any of the Sawyer Shepherd books, they're all available on Amazon. Sawyer Shepherd Chronicles 1, 2, and 3 are currently available on Barnes & Noble as well in paperback. So you can get paperback, hardcover, or Kindle on Amazon, and you can get paperback on Barnes & Noble. I also have a couple other books that are out there, teacher books, and then of course Killtown, which is my latest book, is available only on Amazon for paperback and Kindle right now. I'm in the process of getting it paperbacked onto Barnes & Noble, so check that out there. Sooner or later, it'll be there. But again, I hope you enjoy the books. Also, feel free to check out my website, chadlehrman.com. That is where I have all sorts of book stuff, and I'm going to probably pretty soon, I have links to merchandise related to the books that I write, and then fairly soon I'm going to try to add some of my side project, which is woodworking, to the site as well. So again, hope you guys have enjoyed the podcast, and we will see you again soon.